The night I came back to the house I grew up in, the heating system was making the same clicking sound it always had, like a clock counting down something I couldn't name. I noticed it immediately when I walked through the door, the same way you notice a familiar smell that used to feel like comfort, but now just feels like warning. I told myself I was tired from the drive. I told myself the unease sitting low in my stomach was just grief about my father and nerves, and the particular weight that comes from walking back into a place that was never really safe to begin with. I should have listened to my stomach. I always should have listened to my stomach. I always should have listened to my stomach. My name is Maya. I'm 32 years old. I work as a senior financial analyst for a logistics firm in Seattle, which means I spend most of my days untangling numbers that don't add up the way people claim they do. I'm good at it. My supervisor once told me I have an instinct for finding the thing that's been deliberately hidden. I thought she meant it as a compliment. I didn't understand yet how much I would need that instinct just to survive my own family. I drove back to Dayton, Ohio on a Wednesday in late October because my father had a stroke. Not a fatal one, but significant enough that his doctors wanted someone with him during the first weeks of recovery. My brother Derek had called me, voice low and measured the way it always was when he wanted something. "Dad is asking for you," he said. I almost told him that was hard to believe. My father hadn't asked for me in any meaningful way in 15 years. But I didn't say that. I said I'd come, because that's what I always did. I showed up when it cost me something, and then I watched my brother receive the credit. Derek was 3 years older than me and had always occupied a different category in my parents' house. He was the one my father coached in baseball, the one my mother defended in every argument, even when he was clearly wrong, the one who got the car at 16 and the down payment loan at 25, and the explanation that some people are just better suited to certain opportunities. Derek had never met an opportunity that wasn't somehow cleared in advance for him. His wife Nicole had understood this immediately when she married him. She didn't love my brother so much as she loved what proximity to my parents' favoritism could produce. The person who had never played by those rules was my Uncle Raymond, my father's younger brother. Ray had been the quiet one in the family, the one who read books and kept to himself and didn't need anyone's approval to feel settled in his own life. He died 18 months before this story starts, a heart attack at 61, sudden and unfair in the way sudden things always are. He'd never married, he had no children, and he had left nearly everything to me. The inheritance totaled just under $400,000. I know the exact number because his attorney, a man named David Park, who had handled Ray's affairs for over a decade, had walked me through every line item with the kind of patient precision that made me understand why Ray had trusted him. The money was mine. It was in a designated account. The transfer had been clean and documented and legally airtight. I had barely touched it. I was letting it sit while I thought carefully about what I actually wanted to do with my life. I think that was the part that made me a target. I hadn't spent it yet, which meant it was still movable, at least in theory, if someone could create the right paperwork. I arrived at my parents' house a little before 7 in the evening. My mother met me at the door with the kind of hug that feels like an apology for something she can't bring herself to name. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than the past few weeks. Derek and Nicole were already there, settled in the living room like they'd been holding court. Derek stood when I came in, gave me the shoulder pat hug he always gave me, the one that communicated we are related, but I don't actually know you. Nicole smiled with her mouth only. Dad was upstairs, already in bed, speech slightly slurred but coherent. He held my hand for a moment when I sat beside him. I let myself believe, for just that moment, that it meant something. Dinner that night was Nicole's doing. She'd cooked, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. She made a big point of saying she'd remembered I liked lemon chicken, which I don't particularly, but I didn't correct her. She poured me a glass of white wine before I asked for one. She was attentive in a way Nicole was never attentive, and something about it made the unease in my stomach shift into something sharper. I told myself I was being paranoid. I drank the wine. I ate the food. By 8:30, something was wrong with my legs. It started as heaviness, the kind you get after a long drive when your muscles are stiff and asking for a bed. But this moved differently. It crept upward rather than fading, and when I stood to carry my plate to the sink, I had to grip the table edge to keep from going down. My vision stayed clear. My mind stayed completely, horrifyingly clear, but my body was stepping away from me the way a car rolls slowly forward when you forget to set the parking brake. I made it to the couch. I told them I was just tired. I closed my eyes. I was not asleep. That was the thing they didn't understand. Whatever Nicole had put in my food or my wine, it had taken my body, but it had left my mind running at full speed with nowhere to go. I lay there, completely still, completely aware, listening to the house settle around me. Derek and Nicole moved into the kitchen. I heard the low percussion of their voices before I could make out words. Then Nicole's voice rose just enough. We need her signature tonight before she starts asking questions. Derek said something I couldn't parse. Nicole said we'll say she agreed before she fell asleep. She was drinking, Derek. No one will question it. I felt my heart accelerate, but my body couldn't reflect it. I was a person trapped behind glass, screaming without sound. Then I heard Nicole say the words that cut through everything else. David Park already sent the challenge letter. If we don't move the account by Friday, it triggers an automatic hold. We only have tonight. David Park, Ray's attorney. He had sent something, a challenge, which meant he already suspected what was happening, which meant someone had been watching, which meant I was not entirely alone in this. I kept my eyes closed. I kept my breathing slow and even. I needed them to believe the drug had done exactly what Nicole intended. I heard Derek walk toward the living room. I felt him stand over me for a moment. "She's out," he said. Then the sound of a drawer opening in my father's desk, papers rustling, and Nicole's voice low and instructional telling him exactly which lines needed my signature and that they could guide my hand if necessary. That people did it all the time with elderly relatives. That it would hold up long enough. Long enough for what, I wanted to ask. Long enough to drain the account before David Park's hold kicked in. Long enough that by the time I woke up and understood what had happened, it would already be done. Derek left the room again. A door opened and closed. Nicole stepped outside to make a phone call, her voice muffled through the wall. I tested my fingers. The tips moved. Barely. But they moved. I spent the next 20 minutes doing nothing but willing sensation back into my limbs, the way you coax feeling into a foot that's fallen asleep, methodical and focused, and absolutely silent. By the time Nicole came back inside and checked on me, I had enough in my left hand to close it slowly around the edge of the couch cushion. She stood over me for a moment, said nothing, went to the kitchen. I opened my eyes. The room was dim. The lamp by the front window threw a low, warm light across the floor. My father's desk was in the corner, and I could see the edge of a manila folder sitting open on the surface. Even from the couch, I could make out my name printed on a tab. I had perhaps 20 minutes before Derek came back, maybe less. Getting to my feet was the hardest thing I have ever done. My legs held, barely, the way a chair holds when one leg is cracked and you know not to trust it. But you sit down anyway because you have no other option. I moved to the desk. I took my phone from my pocket. I photographed every page in that folder. Then I picked up the folder itself and pushed it into the inside of my jacket and buttoned it closed against my body. I walked out the front door. I didn't take my bag. I didn't take my suitcase. I took my phone, my keys, my jacket, and the folder pressed against my ribs. The cold air outside hit my face like something honest. I drove 4 blocks before I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too hard to steer properly. I sat in the parking lot of a closed dry cleaner and breathed until the trembling subsided. Then I called 911 and told them I believed I had been drugged and needed a medical evaluation. I used those exact words because I had watched enough legal proceedings through my work to understand that exact language matters. I told them where I was. I told them not to contact my family. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. I told them everything I could reconstruct about what I'd eaten and drunk and when the symptoms began. At the hospital, they drew blood. The attending physician, a focused woman who wrote notes without looking up, told me they would test for a range of sedative compounds. She said it quietly, the way doctors speak when they already suspect the answer and they want you to be prepared for it. When the results came back 2 hours later, They showed a significant concentration of a muscle-relaxing compound, the kind used in certain surgical procedures, the kind that is not available over a counter and does not end up in someone's wine glass by accident. I sat in that hospital bed with the test results on the screen beside me, and I thought about how many times in my life I had explained away the things my family did. The money that went missing from my college savings account that my father said was a banking error. The job recommendation my brother told me he had written for me that I later found out he had never submitted. The way my mother always looked slightly to the left of me when I spoke, as though my voice was coming from somewhere she wasn't quite sure of. I had explained all of it. I had made room for all of it. I told myself that difficult families were something you learned to navigate, not something you named. I named it that night, finally and completely and without apology. At 6 in the morning, I called David Park. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting for a call from someone. When I gave him my name, he exhaled the way people exhale when they've been holding their breath for a long time. "You're okay," he said first. Then, "I've been trying to reach you since Monday." He told me what he knew. For the past 4 months, someone had been making inquiries about my inheritance account through a financial services firm that had no legitimate connection to my uncle's estate. The inquiries were framed as coming from a family representative, which legally meant nothing, but which had raised flags at the bank. David had received a notification, standard procedure when someone challenges estate documentation. He had sent a formal challenge letter to the firm. He had been trying to warn me before anything moved. The firm, he said, was registered under a name I didn't recognize. When I searched it on my phone while he was talking, I found Nicole's maiden name buried 3 corporate layers down. Nicole had set up a shell structure. She'd been planning this for months. Derek, I realized, was not the architect of this. He was just the person she had convinced to hold the pen. "I need a lawyer," I told David. "I know one," he said. "Her name is Angela Reyes. She's going to want to see you today." Angela Reyes worked out of a small office in downtown Dayton that smelled like strong coffee and old paper. She was in her 50s with short gray hair and the manner of someone who had seen enough bad behavior from families to be permanently unsurprised by it. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. She looked at the photographs of the documents on my phone. She looked at the hospital blood test results. Then she put her pen down on the table and looked at me directly. "This is financial fraud," she said. "The shell company, the forged authorization, the drugging, the last part alone is a felony. The combination is significant prison exposure. Are you ready for what that means for your family?" I thought about my father upstairs in his childhood home asking for me in a voice made slow by a stroke. I thought about my mother hugging me at the door in a way that felt like apology. I thought about Derek's shoulder pat hug and Nicole's lemon chicken and the manila folder she had prepared with my name on the tab. "Yes," I said. Angela moved fast. Within 48 hours, she had filed an emergency motion to freeze any pending transactions tied to my inheritance account. She had contacted the Financial Crimes Unit of the County Prosecutor's Office. She had subpoenaed records from the shell company Nicole had registered. She told me to stay in Dayton, stay out of contact with my family, and write down everything I could remember from that evening in as much detail as possible. I wrote 11 pages. The fraud was more extensive than even David had suspected. When the investigators pulled the records from Nicole's shell company, they found not just the one transaction attempt on my account, but a pattern going back 8 months. She had tried 3 different approaches to access the inheritance before settling on the drugging plan. She had drafted letters in my name. She had impersonated me on a phone call with the estate bank. She had created documentation suggesting I had expressed interest in liquidating the account and transferring management to Derek as my designated representative. The forged documents were sophisticated. They would have passed a casual review, but Angela's forensic accountant found the metadata embedded in the files that showed they had been created on Nicole's home computer, and the signature on the authorization forms used slightly different spacing than my actual signature on file, and the notarization seal used belonged to a notary who had no record of ever meeting me. Every single thread Nicole had pulled out, investigators followed back to the source. My brother's role was harder to define. He had known. That was clear from the conversation I had partially overheard and from the text messages investigators pulled from his phone. but his knowledge had been shaped almost entirely by what Nicole had told him. And what Nicole had told him was that I had been secretly draining a fund that was supposed to be shared family money, and that what she was doing was simply reclaiming what was rightfully theirs before I disappeared back to Seattle with it. My uncle had left money to me specifically. There was no shared family fund. Nicole had invented that narrative from scratch and fed it to my brother over months, carefully and incrementally, the way you cook a frog. When investigators showed Derek the actual terms of Ray's will and the actual history of the account, the color left his face in a way I had never seen before. He looked like someone who had just understood that the ground he was standing on had been constructed entirely out of lies. I felt something watching him process that. I won't call it sympathy, I'll call it recognition. He had been used to in a different way for different purposes. That didn't make him innocent, but it made him something more complicated than a villain. Nicole was not complicated. Nicole had understood exactly what she was doing from the beginning. The hearing was 3 weeks after the night I walked out of my parents' house. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, fluorescent lit and quietly functional. Nothing like what television prepares you for. I wore a gray blazer I had bought the day before because I had left all my clothes at my parents' house and I wasn't ready to go back for them yet. Angela sat beside me. David Park sat in the row behind us. I did not look at Derek and Nicole when they came in, but I felt Nicole's eyes on the side of my face, the way you feel a cold draft from a window you know is sealed but can't explain. The prosecution presented the financial records first, the shell company documentation, the phone call recordings, the text messages between Derek and Nicole that used careful language but not careful enough. Then they presented the hospital blood test. The toxicologist who took the stand explained in straightforward clinical language what had been found in my system, what compound it was, what its effects were, and that the concentration present was consistent with deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure. The judge, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked over the test results for a long moment without speaking. When Angela presented my testimony, I answered every question the same way I answer questions at work when I'm explaining a financial discrepancy to a senior partner. Clearly, specifically, without drama and without omission. I told them what I ate, what I drank, what time the symptoms started, what I heard, what I photographed, what I did next, the sequence of a person who kept their head when their body had been taken from them. At one point, the opposing attorney attempted to suggest that I had taken something voluntarily and was now misremembering the evening. Angela asked him, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment, whether he intended to argue that I had voluntarily administered a surgical-grade muscle relaxant to myself and then photographed a folder of fraudulent documents and driven to a hospital to have my own blood drawn. He withdrew the line of questioning. Nicole was convicted on 2 counts of financial fraud, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of administering a controlled substance without consent. The last charge carried the most weight. She was sentenced to 6 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 4. The financial fraud conviction added mandatory restitution, which meant that every asset she and Derek held jointly was subject to review. Derek pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit fraud in exchange for cooperation with investigators. He received 18 months of probation, a significant fine, and mandatory participation in a financial crimes diversion program. Standing in that courtroom watching him accept the terms, I thought about the person he might have been if he had grown up in a house where fairness was something people actually practiced. I don't know if that person existed anywhere inside the one I watched, but I thought about him anyway. My father watched the proceedings from a seat near the back, still recovering, still uncertain on his feet. He didn't speak to me before or after. When it was over and I was standing in the hallway outside the courtroom, he walked past me slowly and then stopped with his back to me. I could see the effort it took him to stand there. He said in the careful, slow speech his stroke had left him with that he hadn't known. I understood he meant what Nicole had been doing. I also understood that what he hadn't known could fill a very small room compared to everything he had chosen not to see over the course of 32 years. I told him I believed he hadn't known about Nicole specifically. He nodded. He started to walk away. Then he stopped again. "I owe you more than that," he said. "Yes," I told him, "you do." He didn't turn around. He kept walking. I stood there and watched him go, and I understood that this was probably as close to an acknowledgement as I was ever going to get from my father, and that it was both inadequate and real, and that I could hold both of those things at the same time without breaking. My mother called me the week after the conviction. She didn't apologize directly. She spoke around the edges of everything the way she had always spoken, carefully and with many pauses, as though the direct path through any conversation was a road she had never learned to use. She said she hoped I was doing well in Seattle. She said she thought about me. I told her I thought about her too, and I meant it in the complicated way you mean things about people you love and cannot trust. I don't know what my relationship with my family looks like going forward. That is an honest answer, and I think honesty is what this story deserves after everything. I know that Derek is in counseling. I know that my parents are selling the house, which means I'll eventually have to decide whether to go back for the things I left there or simply let them go. I know that David Park sent me a final accounting of my Uncle Ray's estate after everything was settled, and that the number at the bottom was exactly what it had always been, untouched, intact, still mine. Ray used to tell me when I was young that the quietest people in any room were usually the ones paying the most attention. He said it like it was a compliment. I understand now that he was also telling me something about himself, about how he had watched my father for decades and understood what he was, and had made a decision to leave his money specifically to me for reasons he never needed to explain out loud. He had trusted me to do something real with it eventually. I'm back in Seattle now. My apartment is on the 4th floor of a building near the water, and in the mornings when the light comes through the east windows, it lands on the kitchen floor in long, warm rectangles that I find myself standing in longer than I need to. I have not been sleeping in late, but I have been sleeping without locking my door twice and checking my windows and lying awake running through conversations that already happened. That is newer than it sounds. I think about the night in my parents' house sometimes, the particular quality of the silence after my body stopped cooperating and my mind kept going. I think about what it felt like to be completely alone inside my own body with the sound of my family making plans for a version of my life I had never agreed to. I think about the decision I made, in whatever space exists between paralysis and action, to not wait for someone to save me. Nobody came through the door that night to pull me out. I pulled myself out. I walked into the cold with a folder against my ribs and drove 4 blocks and made the call and told the truth in the exact, specific language that the truth deserves. For most of my life, I thought that being quiet and careful and undemanding was a form of protection. If I didn't ask for too much, no one could take anything from me. If I stayed small, I stayed safe. That night in Dayton proved something I am still processing. Staying small had never protected me. It had just made me easier to aim at. If you're someone who has been told, in whatever words your family uses, that your needs are the problem and your instincts are wrong, and wanting what belongs to you is a form of aggression, I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say it. You are not the problem. Your instincts are data, and whatever belongs to you is worth standing up in a gray blazer in a fluorescent-lit courtroom and saying, plainly and without apology, "This is mine, and I am not invisible, and I am not going to disappear just because it would be convenient for you if I did." If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me why. And if you want to hear what happens when someone finally stops being the quiet one in the room, subscribe. The next story is one you won't want to miss.